Welcome to the College of Complexes. This is our 479th meeting since we started in February 2009. It actually started in Chicago in 1951 for the purpose of solving all the world's problems. They're still working at it, so are we. But anyway, we put a speaker on every week, different subject. Our speaker is required to take a position on an issue or express a point of view. They have to be for or against something. We don't care what it is. We give them an hour to make a presentation. If they go over an hour, we cut them off. If anybody interrupts the speaker, we remind the interrupter we listen to only one fool at a time, one of our rules. Then we have questions and answers from the audience of the speaker, not speeches. Then we have remarks, rebuttals, everybody in the audience at once who gets 5 minutes at the podium here to respond to the speaker said for or against. Our speaker gets the last word, gets a comment, close the meeting. That's how it works. But before we introduce our speaker, we have time for announcements. Anybody have any announcements they want to make? Now's the time.
All right. Be very careful getting up there.
Watch this.
Yeah, I'm watching. Well, the Dallas Philosophers Forum is meeting this Tuesday, which is 22nd of October, at Aboka's Restaurant in Richardson off of Beltline Central. And it's going to be an interactive session on the Tao Te Ching. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but
Who chain?
Tao Te Ching, whatever, T-A-O-T-E.
Oh, the Tao Te Ching.
The Tao Te, whatever it is, Tao Te Ching. Anyway,
Tao Te Ching.
it's supposed to be interactive, and the speaker is apparently an expert on it, whatever it is. So anyway, everybody's welcome to come. It's $5 to listen to the talk, and the food's good.
What was the subject?
The Tao Te Ching. It's a Chinese.
And you're none the wiser now.
Whatever.
It can. Is it based on Taoism?
You
T-A-O-I-S-M?
know,
It's the
you can
basis
look it
of-
up. I mean, there's a blurb on the website, philosophersforum.org.
It's the basis of Taoism.
Okay, the basis of Taoism, whatever it is. Okay, so anyway, if you're interested, you can come, and the food's good.
Okay, good. Our speaker next week is Jan Lee. She's a PhD in anthropology and a Mandarin teacher. She's going to talk about is China a friend or foe? And it ought to be interesting. It's on Attaining. I'm not going to read all this. November 2nd, we have Jim Gatewood. He's going to talk about On War and Diamond, Gallows Godfather. He's a new book he wrote, and he's going to discuss that. That should be good. He's quite an interesting fellow. On November 9th, on Money and Politics and Gerrymandering, two essential democracy reforms. Ann Drum, who our speaker knows, will be here to talk about that, and Joan Riley to discuss the benefits of making our democracy more responsive to our citizens. That should be interesting. And on November 16th is the next open meeting. If anybody wants to be a speaker, let me know. But tonight we have Garrett Pennell. He's going to talk about attaining carbon-free and a dividend. He's a citizen climate lobby activist. He discuss how we need to put a fee on carbon emissions and distribute the net revenue from that fee to the American people. He will argue that this is the single most effective, politically viable thing we can do to reduce carbon emissions within the brief amount of time that scientists tell us that we have to get this problem under control. So without further ado, give a very, very warm welcome to Garrett Pennell.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank the college for having me out tonight. I was told that you guys are a very cool, interesting crowd, and I can definitely agree with that after the short time that I've been here. Regardless of your political positions, it's incredibly important that we talk about this issue. So I'm a volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby, as was mentioned. I'm an IT guy by day. I'm not paid to be here. I'm a volunteer. I'm here as an activist and a citizen. Fortunately, the science on climate change, the big picture, the stuff that matters for policy, the stuff that matters for telling us, what we should or shouldn't do, that's been settled for about 30 years. This talk assumes that when the vast majority of climate scientists say that the current warming we're seeing is caused overwhelmingly by human activity, that they're telling the truth. If we disagree on this, I will make a best effort to answer your questions, but we're probably going to talk past each other a little bit. So when I got here, I met Jana, and Jana is super sweet and nice. And she asked me what we're talking about tonight, and we immediately started kind of talking past each other on this issue. And then Jana said, so I guess I'm your adversary then. And I want to let everyone up here tonight know, if you're starting from a position of not agreeing that climate change is caused, the current warming we're seeing is caused by humans, you are not my adversary. We're not adversaries. We're all in this together. We need to talk about this issue. We need to have a dialogue, and we need to look for places we can agree and look for ways to move forward. This country has never been more divided. My organization that I'm with, that I volunteer with, Citizens Climate Lobby, we want to make climate change a bridge issue and not a wedge issue. There are so many things we can argue about. Let's pick this one thing to work together on. So why am I here? I love Texas. I grew up in Texas. I'm a Texan. I'll always be a Texan. I was born here. I plan to stay here. And I love the natural beauty of Texas. I love it so much that every Sunday, or not every Sunday, but many Sundays, I go to volunteer up in Allen with a project to restore Blackland Prairie. So if you don't know what the Blackland Prairie is, this whole area here, 32, this whole swath of land, it encompasses millions and millions of acres. That is the Blackland Prairie. That encompasses Dallas and I think Waco and just kind of down that area, down that way. And this was just rolling prairie. It was beautiful, beautiful land, and then people came and farmed on it, and now it's not. Less than 0.1% of the Blackland Prairie remains. So I'm someone that cares about Texas wildlife, and think this is a bobwhite quail, and the bobwhite quail used to be pretty prevalent in these parts, and now is definitely not so much. Species like that are having a hard time sticking around when their food is gone, when the grasses that they expect to be there is gone, when they can't lay their eggs because the grass clumps differently, the non-native grasses clump differently. So we're working to restore this prairie to at least some little section of it, some little tiny piece of it to its natural state, and we have a quail enclosure there, and there's so many insects. It's beautiful. But the thing is that all of these species, the native species of Texas, and this applies really everywhere, are adapted to a very specific range of temperatures, precipitation, and things of that nature. So one of the reasons that I'm here, one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this issue, is that we can put all of this effort into restoring, prairie or restoring habitat to its natural state. And it would take a monumental effort to do that, but even if we did have all the people and all the resources and all the money to do that, if we do that and then the precipitation patterns change, if the temperature ranges change, if rains come at a different time, if the wind blows different directions, if the weather patterns that have been in place for thousands of years change, these species can't thrive here. All of that work that we're doing up in that meadow restoration project in Allen will be for nothing. So scientific theories are always being updated and always being reassessed. Researchers are always collecting new data, updating models of how things work. Now, like I said, the part of climate science that matters for policy, the risk to civilization, the urgency of getting under control, that has not changed meaningfully in my lifetime. I'm about to be 30. So we've known about the greenhouse effect itself since before the Civil War. It's not new. Computer models in the 80s were showing warming at about the same rate and about like we're seeing now. This is, of course the models have gotten better. Of course we can see things in more detail, but the big picture itself has not changed. I wanted to also mention, this talk will be from the perspective of, my agreement with the world's experts on this subject, that climate change, that the warming that we're seeing now is human caused. Now, if you disagree with that, we're not enemies. I'm just going to probably have a really hard time answering your questions. We're going to talk past each other a little bit, but I will do my best. I will be intellectually honest, and I just expect the same of you guys, and I have no doubt that you will be. So, I do want to say that this presentation is not going to be an in-depth explanation of climate science, but I will let the scientists speak for me on this one. So 7 different research groups looked into the question of, what is the scientific consensus on climate change? So So 7 different research groups looked into this over the last 10 years. They examined thousands of papers, or they just directly asked scientists what their position is. And they found that between 91 and 100% of published climate scientists agreed, based on the evidence, that human-caused global warming is occurring. And the average was about 97%. Not only that, the National Academy of Sciences and their counterparts from 79 other nations agree, as do all major American member organizations of physicists, chemists, meteorologists, and astronomers. Not a single one claims that human-influenced global warming is invalid. Not one. If you do want to learn more about climate science, if you're on the fence about the subject, or you disagree and you want to challenge yourself, or you do agree and you want to just learn a little bit more about it, I do recommend Catherine Hayhoe. She's great. She is a climate scientist from Texas Tech, and she is amazing. She's a really good science communicator. She's got some good stuff on YouTube. There's also a site called skepticalscience.com, and they go through a lot of the misinformation and disinformation about climate science, and there is a lot of it out there. And so a lot of the arguments that you've heard that would put it in doubt, they really go through and explain that. So this talk is from the perspective that it is happening, it's because of us, and that we're sure. So just want to let you know the assumption there. So how are we doing on getting this under control? Not great. We're not doing good at all. Very, very bad, actually. So scientists tell us that we need to stay under 2 degrees Celsius to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, and all the current national plans don't even get us close. That includes the Paris Climate Agreement. So, we're looking if all of the agreements under the Paris Climate Agreement, if all the commitments by nations are followed, we're looking to hit about 3.4 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average. That is not good. Scientists tell us that we need to stay below 2 degrees Celsius and ideally below 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average. But is that really that bad? 4.2 degrees Celsius versus 3.4. 2 degrees Celsius is about 3.4 degrees Fahrenheit versus 6.1 degrees Fahrenheit. Is a 3-degree difference that big of a problem, right? So the problem is that when you add heat to a complex system like the Earth's climate, it doesn't get distributed evenly. So this visualization shows the departure from the 1979 to 2000 average across our part of the world. For a single day, this is weather. But as you can see, it's not like the entire world got heated up by just evenly by the same amount. This is a good visualization of how heat does not get distributed evenly, basically. You can see how hot Greenland is compared to the average, for example. So imagine you have an average temperature of 72 degrees Fahrenheit, and you think of like a comfy bedroom or like a cool fall day. But what if that's the average temperature of throwing a bunch of ice cubes into a skillet? You gotta think about more than the average. The impacts of climate change don't come from the global average, they come from the weather and weather patterns that arise when you destabilize the climate by adding heat to it. And we're going to talk about those we're going to talk about those impacts here in a moment. So how much heat are we adding? How much excess heat are we collecting, over the whole surface of the planet? Well, it's about 250 trillion joules per second. And I don't think many of you would probably know what that is. I don't know what that is. I can't visualize that. But it's about 4 or 5 of the atomic bombs that hit Hiroshima every second, just being distributed into the atmosphere, the land, and the seas. So, and about 93% of that heat is being absorbed into the oceans. So water is a great heat sink. It's been acting as a buffer. The warming that we would otherwise see without that buffer would be a lot worse. So the problem, one of the many problems there, is that the ocean's ability to sequester heat changes over time. So sometimes the ocean will absorb a little bit more, and sometimes it will absorb a little bit less. And it's been kind of absorbing some more of the heat, but then there's about a 10 or 15 year period that it'll kind of shift to releasing or at least absorbing a lot less heat. So that's one of the things that we can kind of see, and we can't depend on the ocean to continue to be this buffer. And it also comes at the cost of destabilizing marine ecosystems, really devastating them. Excuse me. It fuels more intense hurricanes. It causes sea levels to rise. And one of the reasons to do that, or one of the reasons that happens aside from just the melting ice caps or glaciers or whatever, is that when water heats up, like most things, it expands. So it's not just from things melting; it's also from warmer water. It takes up a little more volume. So that's another thing to know. So how much time do we have? We've got about 11 years to cut global emissions by more than 40%, and that's to stay under that 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial average. You've probably also heard some things in the media about doing something about climate change before it's too late, right? And you've probably been hearing this for decades. It's too late, it's too late, we're almost out of time. How can it always be almost too late, right? Well, if you've been paying attention, if you read the content of those articles, it's because various windows of opportunity have been closing. So the opportunity to preserve the world as it was has come and gone. The opportunity to enjoy a world with noticeable but minimal climate disruption has come and gone. The opportunity to avoid natural and humanitarian disasters that are amplified and multiplied by climate change has passed us by. And we do still have the opportunity to leave a habitable world for future generations, but it's quickly slipping through our hands. So we've got about 11 years to take the steps necessary to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius and avoid the worst impacts. I want to talk a little bit about the global impacts of climate change that we're already seeing. So the Northern Hemisphere just experienced its warmest, tied for the warmest year on record, tied with 2016. The heat also brought Arctic sea ice to its lowest extent. The Arctic is basically, a lot of people kind of call it the air conditioner of the planet. The Arctic, the weather in the Arctic, the amount of ice in the Arctic, what's going on up there affects us down here. That's, in fact, you've probably heard of the polar vortex. One thing that happens is that as the Arctic warms, the polar vortex, which is always going on around the Arctic, it kind of breaks down. It loses strength, and when that happens, it can instead of being this tight, vortex around the Arctic, it can kind of come down into lower latitudes. So if you've noted, like the past few years, we've seen these crazy just drops in temperature. This Arctic air hitting us, and it seems to be happening more and more and more. They call them like an ice apocalypse or all these other funny terms. We're getting these more often. So that's just kind of another consequence of the Arctic, what's going on in the Arctic. The 5 hottest years on record were the last 5. The 20 warmest have happened in the last 22. So this is not a future problem, it's a now problem. And it's only going to get worse until we address it. People are already dying, businesses are already being impacted, and we're already paying the cost. It's not getting cheaper. So places that never burn are burning. Wildfires are releasing carbon stored in trees back into the atmosphere. And thawing permafrost is releasing methane, which is more potent than CO2 in the short term, back into the atmosphere. So these are examples of feedback loops that if we don't get climate change under control, they can escape our ability to stop them. That is part of one of the main reasons this is so urgent. We can still do something about this. It is possible for this problem to get to a point that we can't do anything about it anymore with any existing technology, with any amount of money. So the pace of climate change is already surpassing the predictions of the best models. So a lot of people will say the models are biased, the models aren't accurate. To an extent, that's true. The models are biased in an optimistic direction. What's going on is that the things that we're seeing are happening faster than we expected. The warming is happening faster. And then we update the models, and we say, okay, well, let's take these other effects into account. And then things happen faster and faster. The pace of climate change keeps outstripping the ability of the models to represent them. I want to show you just the distribution of summer temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere. This is 1951 to 1980. You'll notice that extremely hot temperatures are not that common. In 1983 to 1993, you're getting more of those. In 1994 to 2004, even more. 2005 to 2015. And that was, well, the last one of those. But we've had thermometers for hundreds of years. This is something that can be directly measured. So there is no other explanation than the climate is literally changing. We know that. We know that for sure. You've also probably heard that it's not possible to link a specific weather event to climate change, but that's not really the case anymore. something interesting that we can do is we can run weather models multiple times, and that's the same ones that power the weather app on your phone. We can run them both with and without the human-caused excess in greenhouse gases, and then we can compare the outputs of those models. So you can get an idea you can say take Hurricane Dorian or take Hurricane Harvey, and you can have the weather models with all the data from radars and radiosondes and all the scientific instruments, and you can have it set up, and you can say run this one with the excess human-caused greenhouse gases, run this model as if that never happened, as if we never industrialized, as if we just had Hurricane Harvey without the effects of human activity. And you can run those hundreds of times and make a statistical comparison that will show you, roughly how much wetter Hurricane Harvey was, how much more rain we would get, things like that. So this is something that can be directly measured. It's called, directly modeled. And it's called extreme weather attribution. I'm not a climatologist, I'm not a meteorologist, but if you want to look more into it, you can check it out at worldweatherattribution.org. But we now have ways to see the impacts of climate change compared to a virtual world that doesn't have climate change. So that's one of the ways that we know, what the impacts that we're seeing are. So heat-related illness is one of the leading causes of death or disability among high school athletes. When the heat index goes up, what happens, right? And we're going to look at a projection for future heat indexes here in a few minutes. The same applies to soldiers. Our soldiers are facing this issue directly. Our ability for our country to defend itself is at risk. This is Naval Station Norfolk. This is so the Navy has 4 shipyards. It has 2 shipyards that can dry dock aircraft carriers. We're expecting that this one will not be available for use in a few decades. They're already dealing with flooding. They're already dealing with, with more common flooding. And when this happens in a dry dock, when this happens when you're trying to dry dock and work on a ship, that can catastrophically damage the ships. This is a defense issue. By the way, how am I doing on time?
Oh, you got 40 minutes.
40? Okay. So the authoritative source for information about the way that climate change is going to affect the U.S. is the National Climate Assessment. It's a joint product of 13 federal agencies, and it gets updated every 5 years. I'm not going to go into just this. It's a huge document, but I just want to give you one excerpt from it, and then we're going to go into a few more details for the local impacts later. But one of the takeaways was without more significant global greenhouse gas mitigation and regional adaptation efforts, climate change is expected to cause substantial losses to infrastructure and property and impede the rate of economic growth over the century. That's a pretty bold statement, and that's, like I said, 13 of our federal agencies. There's also been, we've also had from the Global Change Program with the government, there is they've done an assessment of the health impacts of climate change. And some interesting things that I didn't really think about or know about, aside from just, it's going to be hotter and I might pass out or what have you, here's some interesting ones. Rising temperatures increase salmonella prevalence in food. Longer seasons and warming winters increase the risk of exposure and infection. Ticks will show earlier seasonal activity and a generally northward range expansion, increasing risk of human exposure to Lyme disease-causing bacteria. Rising temperatures and wildfires and decreasing precipitation will lead to increases in ozone and particulate matter, elevating the risk of cardiovascular and respiratory illnesses and death. Increases in water temperature will alter timing and location of Vibrio vulnificus growth, increasing exposure and risk of waterborne illness. I didn't know what that is. It's a bug that's very similar to cholera. So there's a lot more to worry about than just it being hotter and uncomfortable. So this guy is no tree hugger. This is an American banker. He served as the 74th Secretary of the Treasury under George W. Bush. He's a Republican. Before that, he was the Chief Executive Officer of Goldman Sachs. And he says that climate change is the biggest economic risk that the planet faces. And just for sake of time, I will skip this guy, but he is Rostin Brenham. He sits on the federal government's 5-member Commodity Futures Trading Commission. No, I don't want to skip this because this is really interesting. He says that financial risks from climate change were comparable to those posed by the mortgage meltdown that triggered the 2008 financial crisis. And he says that it's abundantly clear that climate change poses financial risk to the stability of the financial system. This isn't just about having to sweat a little bit more. So what does it look like, speaking of sweating, what does it look like in North Texas? Well, it looks like 120-degree temperatures are happening on occasion within 25 years. That's like Phoenix here. And then droughts and heavy rains, how does that make sense? How can it be both, right? It's either going to make it drier or it's going to make it wetter. Well, that's not exactly how it works. So warmer air holds more water for the same reason that it's easier to mix sugar into tea before you add ice. When warm, very moist air hits a cold air mass, we get what's called a rain bomb. Tons of rain dumped over an area over a very short amount of time, which is a lot faster than the ground can absorb it, and that causes flooding. So you probably see this happening more commonly in recent years. We have drought, and then just an enormous amount of rain all at once, right? This is the kind of thing we expect to see more of. And in fact, we see the average soil moisture to be, and this is in the southern Great Plains region from the National Climate Assessment we mentioned a minute ago. This is specific to our region that includes Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. And we don't expect the average precipitation per year to change much, but what we do see is the distribution of that precipitation through time to change. So we expect to see the same precipitation, but instead of having it a little bit throughout the year, we expect to see droughts and then crazy amounts of rain. And what happens is that water runs off before the ground can absorb it, the soil moisture goes down, agriculture becomes harder. A few other interesting things is that we talked about averages not telling the whole story a minute ago. Relative sea level rise along the Texas Gulf Coast is expected to be twice as large as the global average. And just for sake of time, I'm going to move on. So this is a report from the Union of Concerned Scientists. They are a union of scientists who are concerned about this, among other things. So this is from a study called Killer Heat in the United States from July 2019. And we're looking at, historically we've had about 8 days out of the year that were 105 degrees or hotter. By mid-century, if nothing has changed, if we just keep going at the current rate, we're looking at 62 days out of the year above 105 degree Fahrenheit. By late century, 100 days out of the year. So nearly over a quarter of the year by late century above 105 degrees Fahrenheit. You think it's hot now, I won't dwell too much on this. Again, this is just kind of an interesting weather thing. But in September, in Waco, the average high temperature of 97.5 will be above normal for July or August. Now, again, this is weather, but at the same time, if you keep flipping a coin and it keeps coming up heads every single time, it's time to ask some questions. In DFW, every day except for one was at least 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and that broke the previous September record of 21 days in 2005. And we're just seeing these records getting broken all the time now. Now there are a lot of numbers when we talk about climate change. We talk about the business impacts, we talk about electric rates going up by 12% by 2050, we talk about the sea level rise going up again by twice the global average to 1.5 to 2 feet, with property losses in $30 billion statewide. But the thing that gets me is, like I said, I love Texas. I care about my fellow Texans. I care about the people around me. And it's not unlikely, in fact it is likely, that upwards of 4,500 people a year will die as the result of the effects of climate change by 2050. For comparison, diabetes killed 5,832 people in Texas in 2017, according to the CDC. In 2013, the annual auto fatalities were about 3,400. So if we don't do something, this is going to get to the point where climate change is killing more people than car accidents. So I want to make the case that, what's my time?
Oh, you got,
You're fine.
you're fine, you got a half an hour.
So I want to make the case that carbon fee and dividend is the most effective and politically viable solution. And to do that, we should probably talk about other solutions a little bit. So I can't go into too much depth on them. I'm definitely not an expert, but I will try to just kind of run through some of the other things that we could do about climate change, and then we'll talk about the policy that I want to advocate for tonight. So what if we just use technology to suck greenhouse gases out of the air? The good news is that's a thing that we can do. And in fact, it's getting cheaper to do it. It used to be about $600 per ton of CO2 to just pull it out of the air. But as of 2018, the cost of doing it has gone down to $94 to $232 per ton of CO2. It's getting a lot cheaper. So this is not in the realm of viability yet, but it is something that we can do. And in fact, we are going to need technologies like this, more specifically, technologies like BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which involves burning organic matter to generate energy and then collecting and sequestering the carbon from that. The problem is that it's not there yet. And this is a business. This is carbon engineering in British Columbia. And they do really cool stuff. This is really neat. The thing is that they are a private business. They're not going to just take carbon out of the air and pump it underground because nobody's going to pay them to do that. And that comes into kind of the political viability of this issue. Where is the money going to come from to suck carbon out of the air and put it into the ground with no other plan? That money's going to have to come from governments, right? And of course, nobody likes paying for things, so there's kind of some of the problem with that. But that said, this is great technology. It's really interesting, and it actually is part of the solution. We'll probably talk a little bit about that later. What if we plant 1 trillion trees? I don't know if you guys have seen articles recently about, hey, let's solve climate change by just planting tons and tons and tons of trees. Well, it actually isn't necessarily a bad idea on paper. According to a new analysis by ecologist Thomas Crowther and colleagues at ETH Zurich, it's a Swiss university, that if we plant 1 trillion trees all over the world, or about 2.5 billion acres, or about the combined land area of the United States, that we could limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050. And that's from the IPCC's 2018 special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. That is a mouthful of a name. But if we do it right, we can restore ecosystems. Like, we can do some good stuff if we plant lots and lots of trees, but the politics of land use are complicated. This land has to come from somewhere. Where does the land come from? Also, what happens if we plant 2.5 billion acres of forest, but we keep releasing more carbon into the air? So this could buy us some time. This is something that we should be looking into, but it's not I don't think it's the single best or most politically viable thing we can do to fight climate change. Now, what if we directly invest into renewables like wind and solar? Well, yeah, we should totally do that. The problem is that according to the 2018 report, I think the same one I mentioned a minute ago, whose name is I will omit for time, is that keeping global warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius is going to require that the world invest about 3 trillion to 3.5 trillion into renewables every year between 2016 and 2050. Now, according to UNenvironment.org, global investment in renewables in 2018 was only at about $288.9 billion, which was just under 10% of the low estimate of what is required. So renewables are growing. They as private businesses, as just the market is building these things out. It is happening, but it's not happening fast enough. But what if we could drive investments into renewables and other carbon neutral energy options, incentivize a move away from fossil fuels, and promote energy efficiency with a single, simple policy? Like maybe cap and trade. So the idea of cap and trade is that the government puts a cap on how much emissions covered entities like factories and power plants can emit. Then they let those entities trade emissions permits. So company A may say, oh, I have this many permits, but I don't need all this. I don't need to release this much carbon into the air. Let me sell my emissions permits to another company, and then you trade the ability to pollute. So it can kind of work, but it's got some caveats. It only covers large polluters. It leaves millions of small sources untouched, like just cars and little companies and things like that. And it requires a lot of administrative overhead. There's also this buying and selling of these permits. You have brokers that do this stuff. They all want to grab a piece of the pie, so it really just causes a lot of confusion and price volatility. So it makes it harder for businesses to make the investments into energy efficiency and more, and cleaner sources of power. And that brings us to, the solution that I would like to propose to you guys tonight. And this is called carbon fee and dividend with a border adjustment. And we'll talk about that. So the idea of pricing carbon, and so there's two parts, right? There's 3 parts. But the parts of fee and dividend, there's the carbon fee. Let's talk a little bit about that. What we want to do is we want to put a price on carbon so that it's not free to pollute anymore. And the reason we want to do that is because, that the carbon that's going into the atmosphere is that is exacerbating, that is causing this current warming that we're seeing with all of these negative effects that we've been talking about. That is a cost to society. That is a cost to all of us that we are all already paying. If you were in Houston when Hurricane Harvey came through and your business was destroyed or you were flooded, that wasn't necessarily 100% caused by climate change, but statistically speaking, there were businesses that may not have been flooded had that not occurred. There are people somewhere, and it's hard to track, but there are some people somewhere, and increasingly so, that are already being impacted by this, that are already paying these costs. And so those businesses have to get rebuilt. They have to take out insurance. It makes their operating costs higher. It means the next time you go into their store, you go into the restaurant, you're going to pay a little bit more. And that's just sort of the horrible thing about all this is that because you can't put a barcode on every single molecule of CO2 and figure out where it came from, it's really, really hard to just charge, this company for, hey, this is your exact amount of, emissions, and we're going to charge you for that. The administrative burden of doing that is insane. It's not possible. So what we want to do is put just a fee on carbon at the point where it enters the economy. Actually, I have a slide about that. We want to put a fee on carbon at the point where it enters the economy. So whether it comes in, over a ship, through a pipeline, out of the ground, however it initially gets here, we put a fee on it right there, $15 per metric ton, and it increases by $10 per year, adjusted for inflation, every year until greenhouse gas emissions are reduced by 90%. So we want to do this. So we talk about putting. We want there to be honest pricing, and so but how can we know what the price is? How do we know that $15 a ton is the correct price, and that the next year $25 is the correct price? So I'll tell you this. I'll tell you what the wrong price is, and that's zero. We know that zero is not the correct price because we know that climate change, which is caused by our, the current warming is caused by our carbon emissions, is already costing us. And if that price is zero, nothing is going to change. So we kind of, instead of solving for X, we solve for Y. We say, look, here's the goal. We know that we need to get our emissions to this point by this time. How do we price it such that that happens? And that's how we decide what this price should be. So we want to put a price of $15 per metric ton, goes up by $10 every year until it gets down to greenhouse gas emissions are reduced by 90%. All this money, and this is where the dividend comes in, all this money is recycled to American residents in an equal monthly carbon dividend, which helps consumers adapt and it helps businesses compete to reduce their carbon footprints. So there's a lot of things that we could do with the money, right? We could just put a fee on carbon and then just burn the money and it would still bring emissions down, but what does that do for people, right? If most of our economy is fueled by fossil fuels and then you start making that more expensive, especially people that are the most vulnerable, everything gets more expensive. So they need a way to adjust to that, and that's where the dividend comes in. So the great thing about this is we put a fee on the carbon, we give the dividend, that lets people adapt, and we're not taking money out of the economy. We're just shifting it away from carbon intensive stuff to less carbon intensive stuff. So it just drives innovation, it drives efficiency, and businesses will compete to reduce their carbon footprints. We also put a carbon border fee adjustment in place, and what that does is it discourages businesses from relocating to where they can pollute more. So countries, jurisdictions that don't have similar carbon pricing legislation to this, it removes that incentive for them to ship manufacturing overseas. They have no reason to do it because when they would ship their products back, we slap the fee on them at that point, so there's no incentive. What this also has the effect of leaning on other world economies to do the same thing. That way the United States isn't the only country footing the bill. So that's an important thing to a lot of people. That's an important thing to me. Everybody needs to play fair. This can't be just the United States doing it. And this is a great way to make that happen. This also, you may have heard of like the Obama administration's Clean Power Plan, which was just a way to regulate greenhouse gases that amended the Clean Air Act. This would suspend the Clean Power Plan, which is actually not even really being enforced right now. For 10 years, But if greenhouse gas emissions haven't been cut by 30% by then the EPA is obligated to issue new rules to put us back on track. So the idea behind that is that we want to. This is something that we want to offer to businesses, right? It's like, hey, don't worry about the regulations. Just there's a price on carbon, and you get to decide how you want to deal with that. We're not going to tell you got to put these specific light bulbs, or you have to, your fleet of cars have to be natural gas or all electric or whatever. We don't want to do anything like that. We just want to say, look, there's a fee on carbon. Figure it out. And a lot of businesses are like, cool, that's great. I don't like regulations. I just want to be able to have a level playing field with other businesses. So this does that. Okay, we talked about that. Now, I did mention that, what's my time, by the way?
You got 20 minutes.
Okay, cool.
The mob won't be here for 15 minutes.
What's that?
I say the mob's not getting here for 15 minutes.
The mob?
The mob.
Okay, well, you let me know when they show up, okay?
Okay.
I don't see them yet either. All right, cool. Are you? I thought that was you guys. All right. So, So the point that I want to make tonight, the motion that I'm for, is that carbon fee and dividend is the most efficient and politically viable thing we can do. Notice that I've been talking about a specific policy, which is the Energy Innovation Act, the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act. It's a specific piece of legislation that Citizens Climate Lobby, the organization for which I volunteer, is advocating, and which is a different thing than just pure fee and dividend, but not by much. I want to just explain a few differences, and this kind of calls back to the political viability aspect of this. So just because of the way politics works in our country, one of the things that we do is there's an exemption for agriculture. So if carbon, fossil fuels that are burned to power agriculture, they don't end up paying the fee. The same applies to the military. So that is like, those are two kind of just differences from a pure fee and dividend standpoint, and these exemptions are purely for political viability. If there are a lot of farmers, there are a lot of people that are concerned about the ability to keep food prices down and things like that, and so this is just a couple of exceptions that are in this bill that don't necessarily come with just pure fee and dividend. And we also talked about the carbon border adjustment. So, and this limited regulatory adjustment refers to essentially the Clean Power Plan. And doing this, we can reduce emissions by at least 40% in the first 12 years. That is substantial. If someone can go find something that gets that kind of emissions cut, I want to know about it. That's amazing. I want to hear about it. I want to support it. But this is supported by economists and scientists as simple, comprehensive, and effective. So what happens is that each adult citizen gets a share of the carbon dividend, and each U.S. citizen under 19 gets half a share. So if you're a family of four, you can end up getting about $3,456 a year from this carbon dividend. And if you make those investments into efficiency, if you put new insulation in your home, if you are using something that's not just coal power, if you're have the right electric plan, or you're using solar, or making these investments, then you can pocket the money. Everybody gets the same dividend. That's how this works. So it incentivizes people to make those decisions, to make those investments. And then the people that aren't able or aren't willing to do that, the dividend helps them offset the cost of the carbon fee. And the primary purpose of this is to get carbon emissions down, but there are some side effects too that are kind of nice. So one of the things that happens when temperatures go up, when it's hotter outside, and in fact, during the summer we have ozone action days. So that happens because hotter weather makes the molecule ozone, O3, in the air, it makes it more prevalent. It increases the amount of ozone. That causes all kinds of respiratory problems. We also get more particulate matter in the air, especially for just in and of itself, but also because of wildfires. When it's hotter, drier weather, wildfires are more common, and that increases the particulate matter in the air. That causes all kinds of respiratory problems. And if we start just by virtue of shifting away from from carbon intensive sources of energy to less carbon intensive sources of energy, we end up saving up to 295,000 lives through 2030 because of just better air quality. That's not even taking into account things like the heat index being higher, some of the direct impacts of climate change. This is just for better air quality. And it can create jobs, and that happens for a couple of reasons. So let's be real, we are talking about overhauling the way that energy is produced and consumed in this country. That is what this would do, because that's what we have to do. Now when you do that, it's going to take people to upgrade electric grids, to retrofit factories, to sell insulation, and then train the workers of the clean energy future. That is going to create jobs. We're going to need people to do that stuff. And then even though the dividend is flat, everybody gets the same thing, it tends to have a larger practical impact on people who make less money. Just because, if you make $25,000 a year and you get an extra $500 per year in your pocket, that's going to go a lot further than somebody making $200,000 a year and getting $500 a year in their pocket. So, and then what happens when people that don't make that much money start getting a little bit more money? Well, they spend it. They don't save it. They don't just keep it. They go spend it. They spend it at local businesses. And this is from an independent study that just kind of visualizes that a little bit. So quintile 1 is people at the lowest end of the socioeconomic ladder. Quintile 5 is people highest. The dark gray shaded area refers to people that are just benefited by the policy. So in quintile 1, in the absolute lowest end, 86% of those people are benefited. 2%, this lighter shaded gray area refers to a minor loss. So less than 2%, or less than 0.2% of income. Now you notice as we go up, the situation doesn't look as good for these guys at this end, right? Only 15% of the people in this gray shaded area benefit from the policy in terms of just direct financial dividend versus excess expenses. But let me explain why that is. So these people don't take a bigger hit because they make more money. They take a bigger hit because people who make more money tend to have more carbon intensive activity. And the people that are in this fifth quintile here, they're also in the best position to make those investments, to say, oh, well, I have a huge house, let me just add more insulation to it, let me switch to solar, let me switch my energy providers. They can make the changes that this policy is intended to promote, and they're in the best position to do it. So we think this is just about the fairest thing you can possibly do. Now, if you have a household income of $100,000 and you fall in the light shaded area, the net cost to you is under $200 a year. So just to put it into perspective, it's fair. It's not that big of a hit, and if it is, then you're probably in a position to do something about it. And we also think that this approach is the best option for any conservatively minded person who wants to address climate change. And the reason for that is because it doesn't appreciably grow the size of government. So there are other ways to do things. You've heard of things like the Green New Deal. You've heard of things like just let's invest tons and tons of money into renewables. Let's raise taxes to do this or that. And this doesn't do that. It doesn't raise the size of government. It just takes money away from fossil fuel intensive things and puts it right back into the economy. It doesn't grow the government. And I would even say that it's the smallest government option, including doing nothing when you consider the domestic and foreign policy actions that governments are going to need to take to deal with unmitigated climate change. So climate change, solving it is going to cost something. There's no way around that. There is no such thing as solving it for free. But that's about as close as you can get. And we see that when we do implement a carbon fee and dividend, it does change the energy mix. So right now, this is the current baseline at a $0 a year carbon fee. Once we have a $10 a year carbon fee, which is a little different, HR 763, the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act, would start at $50 a year, go up by 10 every year. We see, for example, coal taking a pretty precipitous decline. We see increases in biopower, solar, wind especially. Wind is probably going to be the one that grows the most. Yeah. There are a lot of different ways to produce energy, and the cleaner and less fossil fuel intensive ones tend to do really well. And the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act is not the only bill like this. There are other legislations out there that want to put a price on carbon and then use the money for something. So some of these will decrease payroll taxes. Some of them will give 70% of the money back as a dividend, and then 30% of the money to invested in infrastructure or retraining workers or what have you. Personally, I would be kind of cool with any of these being passed, but I still think that the direct dividend is the fairest thing to do, because that doesn't tell anybody how it doesn't force any specific use of the money. I think the market will respond by itself once you have more money being injected into the economy that comes from the carbon fee. And here's another one that's very similar to ours, called the Baker-Schultz plan. As you can see, I don't know if you can see the logos here, but there are a ton of big companies that are in favor of these, including like energy companies. So why would an energy company, why would ExxonMobil or Shell or somebody like that support this? Wouldn't it hurt their business? Well, those companies are not oil and gas companies necessarily. Their product is energy. They're energy companies. And they've made investments in renewables. I would say not enough, but they are making investments in renewables. And these companies are smart. They see the writing on the wall. They want to, they know that they're going to have to make a transition to a future with much lower usage of fossil fuels. And when they do that, they want the playing field to be level. Shell doesn't want to be the one that says, all right, we're going to stop selling oil and gas and we're going to go all renewables. That's not viable for them to do right now. But if all companies at the same time have to play fair and play on the same playing field, they're cool with it. They want to do this. And we're already seeing, we see that there actually is a majority of registered voters that support a policy like this. In fact, Republicans under 40 are more and more coming in line with their, or conservatives under 40 are more and more coming into line with their, liberal or Democrat counterparts. Younger people are pretty much on the same page on this issue. So, we've been here for an hour. I feel like I could have just shown you this and called it a day. About how long has it been actually?
In an hour, you're 8 minutes.
8 minutes? I got 8 minutes left. Okay. Cool. So this is the Economist Statement on Carbon Dividends. 3,500 economists, including 4 formal Federal Reserve chairs, and 27 Nobel laureates have endorsed the general concept of carbon fee and dividend. They find that a steadily increasing fee on carbon offers the most cost-effective lever to reduce carbon emissions at the scale and speed necessary, and that this fee will eliminate the need for cumbersome regulations and give businesses the latitude to plan for a low-carbon future, and that a border adjustment is necessary to protect U.S. competitiveness, and that the carbon dividends maximize fairness and political viability of the carbon fee. So if you don't listen to me, listen to the economists. The position of these guys, of these economists, is that the carbon fee and dividend is the single most effective and politically viable thing we can do to solve climate change. So, and I as a member of the public, right, as a non-scientist, as a non-economist, I don't really have much choice but to listen to this experts on this subject. If the scientists are telling me that climate change is happening and it's caused by humans, I not only have to go with that, I want to go with that. I want to trust scientists. I don't want to, I don't have a problem with trusting the experts on a subject. If my teeth hurt, I go to a dentist, If I need glasses, I go to an ophthalmologist or an optometrist or what have you. And if I want to know what to do about climate change or whether climate change is happening, I go to scientists. So if I want to know what to do about it, I go to the economists. And many of them say that a carbon fee and dividend is the best way to approach that. So we want to slash emissions in half, we want to create jobs, increase GDP, reduce premature deaths, and improve national security. And that's what I want to do. I think this is the best way to go about it. And that is my talk.
You can stay there and answer questions.
Sure.
Who wants to be first?
Yeah, I want to know if there's a test over this.
A test?
Yeah.
What do you
That
mean?
was a lot.
Was that a lot of information?
Yeah.
How much is it usually?
All put together, sweet, so don't worry about it.
Well, thank you. The answer is no.
Paul Ehrlich in 1968 wrote a book that predicted there were going to be hundreds of millions of people dying of starvation in the 70s, which didn't happen. I think Al Gore predicted at least once, maybe a number of times, that various cities would be underwater by 2000 or 2015 or whatever. And people have cataloged these predictions, and Climate Depot has one list of 41 predictions. There's other places that have lists of like 50 predictions made by climate alarmists for the past 50 or so years, none of which have actually happened as they predicted. None, zero, none. So why should we go through all of this trouble and expense when nothing these people have predicted has actually happened?
I don't accept the premise.
Well, you can get the lists.
I have reviewed some of those. I don't have them. It's been a while. But essentially, I don't accept the premise. You know.
Well, how can you accept? I remember reading Newsweek and Time magazine in the mid '70s, and they were saying that, well, we're going to have an ice age, and they had all the articles and all the science and all of the official, universities talking about all the data. I mean, it's definitely going to happen. And it's the same thing with all these other things. And then, of course, you've got, Al Gore just going around saying, well, New York City is going to be underwater by 2000, or Miami is going to be underwater by whatever. And they make all these predictions, and they just don't happen.
So thank you for your question. Again, I follow where the expert opinion on this currently is, and that is that all of the major national academies of science, and we had it on a slide earlier, but the expert consensus on this at this point is that climate change is occurring and that it's caused by humans. And I mean, it sounds like we disagree on that. I would need to probably talk to you later about that. I came prepared to talk about climate policy. Like I said, this whole thing is from the, is predicated on that, the experts being correct on this issue.
Well, all the experts were correct in the 70s on the Ice Age, too.
So, are you talking about global cooling?
Well, there was in the 70s, there was a big hullabaloo just like this
Okay.
about the coming Ice Age. And they had all the universities and all the scientists and all the quotations and all the articles and all the evidence and all that laid out for everybody to just follow and believe. And you go back and find the magazine. I've probably got some of them.
Okay.
Like Newsweek and Time, and you can find like whole issues just laying all this stuff out, just like it's being laid out here.
Okay. I mean, all I can say is that I'm not familiar with the Newsweek articles in the 70s and that kind of thing, but we can sure talk about it later if you like.
Sure.
I think we briefly spoke, I mentioned that so many scientists say when a volcano erupts, there's so much contamination put out that it's more than whatever we have ever done to our planet. And you said you had read otherwise.
I said that intuitively doesn't, thank you for your question. I'll say that intuitively doesn't sound right to me, but I'm not familiar with that, that article or what you read, but we can talk about it later if you like.
What happened?
Battery's dying.
Batteries died.
Yeah, battery. Back some years ago, I had some Hawaiians who trusted my judgment, and they had me read the treaty for the Kahia Reef, the they were getting pressure from Greenpeace to have their reef declared a UN biozone for its protection. And I read the treaty, and I read it, as I've been trained to do in legal documents, I read it backwards, from back to front, and I found out that it was a taxing scheme allowing the oil companies to come in and drill anytime they wanted if they just paid a fee to a UN group who didn't even go to the indigenous Hawaiians. Now, that kind of abuse is already in place under supposedly protecting the environment. How are we going to protect ourselves from that kind of corporate abuse in
Sure.
a new tax?
Okay, so a tax isn't really the best way to describe this. Taxes raise revenue for the
That's
government.
how I would describe it, as a tax.
In a very strict sense, perhaps, but that's semantics. So how do we know that this isn't in this legislation, right? It's about 42 pages. I've read it. There is nothing of that sort. And in fact, one of the reasons that we would want to do something like a fee and dividend instead of direct regulation is that it is simpler. It is easier for people to understand. It is easier for people to work with. There's a lot less room for corruption to occur, because that is a concern, right? That is something we want to avoid. But with a simple fee and then a dividend, there's not a lot of places where people can exact that kind of abuse, I would say. There's a gentleman raising.
Go ahead.
No. It's an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Garrett. And your information is very much up to date
Thank you.
over time. And I also thank you for your work in Area 32. It's important that people jump in.
Thank you.
Okay, and I have a question for you, but with regard to Ken's comments to you. Have you been to Darfur lately?
Where?
Ken?
Question,
Darfur.
let's not,
And
just
also,
ask questions.
36 million people
Okay.
die of starvation every year.
Yeah,
That's okay, because you know.
so what's that got to do with global warming?
The point is that you're saying that this is nonsense science, and
The directions-
well, that's a question, because you're attacking him
It needs to be a
for that.
question to the speaker.
Fine, well, I'm, on your behalf, okay, that's feeding back
No,
some
that works.
information. There's an amendment
Okay.
currently up for vote come November. Okay, and it's Prop 1 as it relates to, giving back sports taxes gained from sports stores. They should have always gone to protecting our state parks and
Okay.
and those kinds of
And
issues.
this is a Texas state thing, right?
Yes, I've done
Okay,
the ballot.
sure.
There are 10 amendments.
Okay.
Or prompts, rather. Amendments, I guess. Prompts, sorry. The point is, that's a tax that needed to be and wasn't used appropriately
Okay.
back when, because they've just been dumping it into the general fund. So based on that, and will that infusion of money, based on the work that you've been doing in some parts,
Sure.
help make a difference? I mean, it's supposed to go to the wildlife protection and a lot of other things with regard to running the parks in general.
Are you asking if, I'm sorry,
Yeah, based on the work that you're doing in that area in particular, is there you've seen the results of not having enough funding in making these areas and protecting them and keeping them, safe, whether it be flora, fauna, what have you.
okay.
Okay, and were you familiar with this property?
Yeah, I read something about that. I read something about that. I'm focused more on the climate policy than I am helping the parks and wildlife and things like that. So I can't speak too much on that. But I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, but
I guess
the
you can
point is
restate your
the
question.
environment's also affecting the habitat of the fauna in particular in these state parks. I mean, there's already thousands upon thousands of species of birds that migrate to Canada, for instance,
Right.
that no longer exist. They're gone, or their migration paths have changed so dramatically because of global warming. So I guess I'm asking you, are you seeing this even in your work in these parks, and would they make a difference? Or if you don't know, it's
Yeah,
okay.
I mean, so let me clarify what my work is. Or, you know, I focus on, we're trying to get a fee and dividend passed, obviously. But in terms of being familiar with the effects on wildlife, in terms of being familiar with that, yeah, I can't speak, I can't speak knowledgeably on that.
Oh, okay. I just thought you might have noticed in your travels that some species are not as
I've
apparent
definitely,
or abundant as
I've
others.
definitely read about it. I've definitely can tell you intuitively what I remember from childhood versus what I see now in terms of, you know, which kinds of insects I see around. Like there's certain bugs that you just don't really see anymore and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's really concerning. I will say that the primary, for most species, the single biggest thing that is impacting them, that is causing, actually there is currently, we are in the midst of a 6th mass extinction. And the thing that is primarily causing that is habitat loss, followed by climate change.
Mm-hmm.
So habitat loss is the primary thing. I definitely can't speak too knowledgeable on that, but I'm very aware of what you're saying. I just don't know that I can add much to it.
Yeah, it's okay.
But thank you for your question.
You're welcome. John?
Yeah, so in terms of the mechanism, the way this works, so it's actually the fee, such as extra fee on gasoline, that then affects the market. So people would use less of it. That's the primary mechanism.
That's the idea.
Right. And so, but then you said, well, then the population gets this fee paid back to them, with the hope that they might use this in insulation, but that they might squander it at the racetracks, for example. So,
Sure.
or is there some mechanism where they have to put in insulation? I mean,
I would say the mechanism where you have to is that it gets to a point. Well, thank you for your question, by the way. I would say that the thing that would force that, or the thing that would at least, the fee goes up every year, right? So the fee increases by $10 a year per metric ton of CO2. So as that fee goes up, it becomes less and less cost effective to do something other than invest in energy efficiency or better sources of fuel or better sources of energy and things like that. So that is the thing that would promote that.
so what, I mean, President Trump has pulled out of the Paris Accords on this, so apparently America is now out of this. And also, the other big problem is China and India, who are the major contributors. So, are you engaged in some international effort that's going to hit China and India on these matters?
Yeah. So the aspect of specifically the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act that does that is the carbon border adjustment. So, if we didn't have a carbon border adjustment, right, we would have a carbon fee here, we'd have a dividend, and then companies would say, oh, well, I can just get out of this carbon fee by shipping my stuff overseas. That incentive goes away when you have a carbon border adjustment because we're charging the imports as they come back in, so there's no way to do that. The other thing is that the carbon border adjustment applies to countries that don't have similar legislation to this one, that don't have carbon pricing in their countries. So if if this legislation gets put into place in the United States, being that we are such a huge economy that we trade with so many different people, or so many different other economies, it's by virtue of that carbon border adjustment, that would lean on those economies to play fair and to implement carbon pricing so that they're also footing their part of the bill for this global problem.
Okay. So actually, remind me, what percentage of the CO2 and methane is America producing compared to, say, the rest of the world? Is it still like 30%, is it, something like that?
That sounds right. I don't know off the top of my head.
I got a chart on CO2 distribution off of a scientist's website that was put out by NASA a couple of years ago.
Okay.
And the amazing thing about it, looking at that chart, is you see very little actual CO2 accumulation in North America at all. Actually, I think Europe has a little bit more. China had a few hot spots, but the major CO2 distribution was the Amazon basin and sub-Saharan Africa. I sent that chart to a friend who is a global warming advocate, and he was telling me that it must be gravity that in the rotation of the Earth that was spinning all that CO2 down into those areas. I'm asking if you have any comment on that.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that chart specifically, so I don't have a comment on it really.
Oh, that was a short answer, okay. Trying to remember what it was I wanted to ask. Have you ever, you've studied various energy sources, have you heard of the Bloom box?
The
Bloom box.
Bloom box?
Right, for a long time I thought it was called the black box, but actually it's the Bloom box. And years ago it was on 60 Minutes, and this little box, maybe the size of this table, maybe not quite as large, had enough energy in it to produce energy for a huge building. And I thought we'd hear more and more about it, but I haven't read anything. You might research that, it's kind of fascinating. I don't know if that's Tesla energy or what.
Sure, I'll check into that, thank you.
So I got confused. There are with your proposal for shifting costs, are you talking about CO2 or are you talking about carbon? They're not quite the same, are they?
Yeah, so that's a good question, thank you. So a lot of times for brevity, I'll say CO2, it's CO2 or the amount of greenhouse gases that would have the equivalent effect to the same number of tons of CO2. So CO2 or CO2 equivalent is kind of how we would say that. The answer basically is, if you're asking like, what does this apply to? It applies to, fuels that are burned, and when things combust, they, generally produce CO2, but it also applies to just greenhouse gases that come out of the burning and use of fuel. So it's not just carbon dioxide, it's greenhouse gases in general.
Okay, so let me ask more directly. Does it apply to carbon dioxide?
Yes.
To the emission of carbon dioxide?
Yes.
So you're aware, I'm really, I'm an advocate of what you're saying, but you're aware that carbon dioxide, that the biggest producer of it on the planet is cows.
Yeah, I think methane would be what you're thinking of there, but the short answer is this applies to what's burned for fuel. It does not apply to methane emissions from agriculture in the way that you're describing.
The second largest producer of carbon dioxide is humans. Every time we breathe out.
Well,
so I have a hard time thinking that you can regulate.
It's specifically for what is burned for fuel.
Fuel.
Yes, sir, for fuel.
I should keep a notebook again. I have read that the way our country calculates the figures on various temperatures in the earth and data is guesstimating to a great extent, and sometimes even using the wrong data. And that actually the Russians have produced a much more accurate method of figuring what the rise in temperature of the oceans are and what's really going on in the universe. Have you read that?
No.
Some years ago, I was confused about the whole global warming issue to the point where I figured maybe I ought to cease my carbon footprint. I got an opportunity and I took classes down at UT Austin in algal culture, because algae breathes carbon dioxide and releases oxygen. Many of them, most algae does. And while I was there, the head of the biology department was working with 3 of our most clean burning coal fire power plants in Texas to set up algae farms so that they would effectively be zero-sum emission.
Okay.
That basically they had scrubbers to take out every other thing, and I mean, you know, when you're burning coal, you've got mercury, you've got all kinds of things, and these already had scrubbers for that. The only thing they had to handle was the carbon dioxide. So he was busy working out plans for that. I called him back a few years later, and under Obama, they just closed the plants.
Was that part of the Clean Power Plan, or?
It, in other words, it seemed to get down to an issue of politics rather than science, because they had the science solved. I'm just asking if, in fact, you see the political hand in this.
If I see the political hand. So what I can tell you is that my approach and the approach of Citizens Climate Lobby with whom I'm volunteering, we are very intentionally bipartisan. We want to advocate for as bipartisan of a solution as possible to this issue. Definitely, climate change is probably one of the most politicized issues of our time, by far. And that's the kind of thing that we would like to change. I can't speak to the coal plant being shut down. I can.
3 coal plants.
Three coal plants being shut down. And you said that they'd implemented like carbon scrub or like scrubbing for the particulate matter
There was
sulfur,
cleaning,
things like that.
There was clean burning as we have the technology to do.
Okay. So I mean, I all I can say on that is that there's different reasons you might shut down a coal plant. They could be clean in terms of sulfur. They can be clean in terms of nitrous oxide emissions or what have you. But I don't want to speak to the Obama plan that you're talking about. I don't know enough about it. But when you ask if I see the political hand in this, I guess what are you suggesting as being the political hand for this specifically in this carbon fee and dividend?
I'm saying if they had the science solved where you had a zero-sum emission situation, and you had a solid plan for that, why would the plant be shut down?
So under this legislation specifically, there actually is, we're talking specifically about carbon emissions, right? Not any other type of pollutant. Under this plan specifically, there is an allowance for carbon capture. So if that coal plant were to be able to capture the carbon before it gets into the atmosphere, they don't pay the carbon fee on that. Or rather, they fee it and then they pay it and then they get a rebate, so it's as if they never had to pay it. It encourages that kind of thing as opposed to discouraging it. So I think the specific concern that you have there under this plan specifically, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act wouldn't apply.
I think we can all agree that California is probably the most forward-thinking state in terms of controlling global warming. And they have come to the point where they are actually legally regulating cow farts. And this is getting to the point where the farmers actually have to put some kind of flatulence trapping device on each cow to capture the flatulence. I mean, this is getting a little bit ridiculous. But hey, this is, they got liberals running the state and they believe in climate warming and they're doing everything they can to fix it. So is this something that we should spread worldwide, or should we have somebody walking behind each cow and lighting up the farts to get rid of them? I don't know. Man.
What is your question as it relates to?
Well, I mean, does what California is doing, does it make any sense? I mean, they've got actual flatulence trapping mechanisms on the cow. You can get pictures of them, and you can look at them, and that's what they're doing. So should we require every farmer, every dairy farmer, to put these flatulence trapping mechanisms on every cow they have to control global warming. Does that make any sense?
In other words, how far should we go?
Yeah, I mean, if California had their way, they'd do it to everybody.
That's dairy cow.
I guess probably any cow.
Probably so.
That was
Just a
more of a
guess.
statement than a question. I think he's asking how far should we go? in your
How
opinion?
far should we go?
Does that make sense?
So, in terms of how far we should go, I think the measure for success on that is, what is a livable planet. If we know that these impacts from climate change are getting more severe. We know that they will continue to get more severe, and we can set a goal of, hey, let's not have that world. Let's not have a world that's completely devastated by this problem. And what do we need to do to get there? And we know that if we keep emissions under if we keep the global average temperature to about 1.5 degrees Celsius, we'll probably be okay. We're gonna have impacts, but we'll probably be okay. And so I would say that is how far we should go. What do we need to do to get to that point? That is the answer. Now, with regard to flatulence harnesses or what have you, I'm not here as an advocate for that kind of thing. I really can't speak meaningfully to that, but I do have an idea of the kind of world that I want to live in and that I want to leave for people, and there are numbers that are put on that. 1.5 degrees Celsius, maybe 2 degrees Celsius. We want to stay below that.
One of the concerns in looking about how the response has been to this carbon issue, it appears that it's driving the energy production more toward nuclear power.
Okay.
We don't appear to have the whole nuclear power equation solved. We keep ending up with nuclear powers leaking and not able to dispose of the spent fuel rods and things like that. So this would be a concern, I would think. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so let me go back to the slide that shows the energy mix changing over time. Under a $10 per year fee on CO2 or CO2 equivalent. Nuclear is in the red. We do see it growing a little bit. But we see relative to where it is now, wind probably being the one that grows the most in terms of just what percentage of the energy mix it makes up. So specifically, is your question, is it a concern of just, you're concerned about nuclear power and I guess could you restate that aspect of it?
Well, I understand you have a chart there. One of the big things we're working at solving is the battery situation, or a way to store energy derived from wind. Not everywhere is like Tehachapi, and you don't have wind blowing all the time. So you have to be able to deal with peak times, and nuclear, if you're not going to have coal plants, nuclear is what's going to step in.
Yeah, you're talking about baseload.
Baseload,
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is definitely something that we need. There are, I'd say a few things about that. That I do think that a carbon fee and dividend is it's the best first step that we can take, but it's not the only thing that we should do. And one of the other things that we should do or can do is invest directly in energy storage technology. That is a thing that we can and should do.
Yeah, I'm just curious what the stripe, I can't see that far.
It's really hard to see even when you're looking directly at it.
I bet it is.
Yeah, it's tiny.
Yes.
I can't really see it on the screen.
What's that after nuclear?
Looks like it's coal new.
Oil, gas, steam.
Oil, gas, steam, that's the purple. That is basically a very thin line right there.
Okay, well, I'm talking about the stripe thing.
Striped here.
Yeah, underneath. What is that?
I think that is gas with carbon capture or carbon capture and sequestration. So using natural gas to burning natural gas and then collecting the emissions from it and burying them.
Modified natural gas.
Yeah, basically.
Did you have a question? Vivian?
Yeah, I do. It's kind of crazy, but
Oh, go for it.
To the
do
mic.
you think that,
Speak
I'm sorry, do you think that, that our climate, we only have seasons now anyway, they're kind of, crazy. Do you think that December could actually be 100 degrees and July could be like 40? You think it could change like that?
That sounds like a very extreme scenario. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know the answer to that question directly. What I can tell you is that fall is that in this region, in the southern Great Plains, that fall is the fastest warming season. So fall is getting warmer faster than summer is. That is so. And there was a December. I remember a year, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, when it was like 95 degrees out in the middle of December. Now that is something that in theory can happen, just with regular weather. But I definitely see some destabilizing going on. I don't know. I can't speak one way or the other to whether it's going to be to the degree that you're describing. I hope not.
I've got one more.
Yeah, actually, how do you propose to counteract this right-wing view that this is all nonsense and we shouldn't worry about this at all because it's politically correct to support the coal industry and so on and so forth?
Yeah, the purely political aspect of it. There's a few ways, coming here and talking to an extremely diverse group of people in terms of opinions and ways of thinking on this, and making it okay to talk about this and not bashing anybody over the head, not being a jerk, and not hating people just because they, have a different opinion on it than I do. There are people that they distrust the scientists. They don't believe the scientists, and there are times where scientists have been wrong. That is a human reaction to something, and the best thing that we can do is to understand where they're coming from on that, and to reach out and find common ground, and and just to keep talking about it.
I mean, don't you? Really, what we've seen in America of late with the hurricanes being more severe, with actually ocean warming, which causes that because they start in Africa and they pick up steam coming across it, and so you're seeing this more and more. So do you ever present this, the evidence of glaciers melting and stuff like that?
What was the question? I'm sorry.
Well, do you actually produce evidence that the scientists produce which shows you that something is going on? Now, whether it's due to global warming or what have you, definitely the seas are warming, glaciers are melting. I mean, that evidence is clear to see, I think.
Sure.
So, would you counteract this by saying, well, this is just a statistical phenomenon that doesn't count, so to speak, or do you say, look, this is solid scientific evidence?
If the evidence for climate change, and specifically anthropogenic climate change, if the evidence made a difference, everybody would already agree with it. We wouldn't be having this discussion, right? I mean, we would be maybe having this discussion, but the evidence doesn't convince people. Values do, narratives do. Humans are social creatures, and evidence is not really the way that you win people over. Surprisingly,
Evidence is not valid, in other words, right?
Oh, it's valid. It's just it doesn't have the convincing power that other things do. Surprisingly.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Does it ever give you pause for thought that the two examples you gave of bankers, Goldman Sachs, and so forth, even kind of going back to Al Gore, it seems that someone in the most elite financial circles sees some kind of profit in this somehow. I mean, doesn't that concern you at all?
I make about $50,000 a year, and I support it.
I think we ran out of questions.
I think we have. You get to sit down.
Oh, great. It's about time. Thank you.
Now it's your turn to talk. You get to come up here and respond to what the speaker had to say, either for or against. You got 5 minutes. So be my guest.
I want my laptop. What's the music?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Crazy.
Let me shut this. Here, I'll try this down. Some light. Well,
Could we ask them to turn up the light in the room here?
turn it up.
Turn it up.
Well, I'll turn it up.
So I didn't get Tom's attention. I want to be sure you know about that there is an election on November the 5th, which is a Tuesday. The new way to do it is that you may vote anywhere in Dallas County. And early voting starts on October 21st and ends on October 31st. So that was my announcement. So he talked about the last thing that he mentioned was really impactful to me in understanding why is this such a hard discussion. I'm going to fit this in. I'm a realtor at Keller Williams Realty, and Keller Williams has these sayings that really, really fit a lot of conversations and a lot of motivations for yourself. And the last thing he said was what had to do with why is this a hard thing to, you were asking the question, why is this a hard thing for us to make a decision about? I think, if I was to put it in quick words. And so Keller Williams has this saying, logic makes you think. So remember you said that if the data supported it and people made decisions based on data, then we would already have had this decision. People don't make decisions on data or logic. And so the Keller Williams saying is that logic makes you think, emotions make you act, which is exactly what he said. This is somewhat literally of when it comes to this snap moment that you make up your mind that this is okay or it's not okay. The global warming is real or it's not. The decision of making that, the decision to make that decision is actually completely coming from your gut. It's not coming from up here. And that's almost all decisions. So, you know, for whatever that's worth, it really helps me sometimes when I'm like, why was that so hard for me to get to the right answer on anything? It could be buying a car, or it could be healthcare, or anything. Logic makes you think, and emotions make you act. So emotions are going to be what makes people decide this. I have COPD, and that's one of my lobbies. If I have a lobby, it's the by God I want to breathe, and it's getting harder. And I can tell you that when I go to my lung doctor, this is not data. This is my gut. This is emotion. But I can tell you when I go to my lung doctor, who is 66, he's been practicing his whole life, and he just says, Gary, it's getting unbelievable. And that's all I know. Dallas County has 3 times the number of deaths from asthma in children of any other county per capita in the country. It's a horrible number. Whether or not it's coming from carbon, I don't know. But I can tell you, if you ever try to breathe burning charcoal, it's not easy. You'll choke. And if you have asthma, you really will. My friend that lives in White House is a real fundo. I mean, he's not just conservative, he's really a fundo. And I visited him about 10 years ago, and we sat on the front porch. I love him. Sat on the front porch and we talked. And across the street from him, he lives in White House, Texas, out in very conservative world. And across the street were these big $300,000 houses 5 years ago. This year I visited him and I said, Roger, where'd the houses across the street go? And it was a day, pretty much the weather like today, and the whole field was full of water. Hadn't rained in weeks. And he said, well, they had to tear them down because their water just stood in the field forever, and they were uninhabitable. So it's happening. I mean, that, is that real? I don't think that was my gut. I do have a problem with one thing that you said about agricultural exemptions. So I got to thinking about, here I am on this cow thing, but I had a friend that was I had a friend that was a real estate developer. And he bought the largest piece of land ever in Dallas County. And he got an agricultural exemption for that land because he put 3 cows out on it. And the tax appraisal district literally had to send guys out there. They sent a whole team to walk, just like you look for a body. They were walking and looking everywhere for these 3 cows, and they finally found them. So I have a real problem with that because I think there's a way to get around that. We have this thing going on right now, I know, in real estate. It's a big deal. Urban farms. There are people that are investing in urban farms. It's legislation, it's political, and it's really cool, and it's tax exempt. So one way to get around that is just put your plants on an urban farm. I just don't know. I had a friend that owned a miniature horse farm. They had about 40 miniature horses on 10 acres in DeSoto. And they quit paying property taxes because the horses made it a farm. These little puppies, horses made it a farm. So I just want you to know that agricultural exemption thing, boy, can it get twisted. My last comment is it's not 1880 anymore. They just, in 1880, it didn't much matter what kind of fuel you used. If you could get something to move by pouring gasoline or diesel, or they used electricity then it was time for innovation. And if you could make a factory, then it was time for innovation. But it's not 1880 anymore.
Just to tack on what you said, Gary, your COPD and health and all that in Dallas. I moved to Dallas in July of 1980. I arrived in the middle of 90 days, over 90 days of 100-degree heat at that time. But it was dry heat. And I came from Australia, so it wasn't a real big problem for me because it felt good when you left an air-conditioned building to feel, the dry heat hit your skin when you walked out. I wouldn't have gone and dug a ditch or wanted to do that, but the point is that from July 1980, I lived in Preston Towers. It's a high-rise building on Northwest Highway, and I faced north. I was on the 17th floor, and you could see it all the way to Plano. You know, it was empty pretty much beyond Campbell and Preston. In fact, Preston Road stopped at Camp, became the Farm Road again, one lane in each direction. When I moved out of the condo to move into my home, 2.5 years later, or 3.5 years later, no more than that, you know, you could see in the horizon that there was more building going on, but not much. It was still pretty clear. But what I did notice, okay, and I couldn't work out what it was at the time, was that not too far off in the distance was this little brown line. And I had no idea where this came from. It wasn't there before. I didn't remember it clearly. And then I worked it out. It was LBJ Freeway. And that's where, with all the cars running along LBJ Freeway, you could clearly see where that freeway was based on the emissions, okay? Anytime I flew to the West Coast on business, every time I flew into LA, it was horrible, you know, the brown muck in the sky. So I am absolutely a firm believer in that man has done this damage, no question about it. And that, you know, in my lifetime, no, I don't remember seeing really dirty polar bears trying to stay alive on one little block of ice, okay? I don't remember, you know, penguins and whatever starving because they can't get to their food source. Don't remember any kind of footage like that. But I do have eyes, I do have ears, okay? And I have a sense of smell, okay? And based on what I've seen and traveled extensively, so therefore I have seen a lot, okay? It is not fine for us to be blasé about the fact that glaciers have disappeared at an alarming rate, or that you have dirty polar bears floating on, you know, little pieces of ice. And it's getting worse, and people are starving, and were starving back in the 70s. The African continent is almost turned into a dust bowl in many, many areas. You know, the biggest gift you can get them is, how do I dig a well, okay? This world is not in good shape. And oh, by the way, as it relates to, you know, sea rise, okay, you would not have wanted to try and catch a subway in New York City when Sandy went through, okay? It has, and yet, you know, greed, man's greed, has allowed areas that should have been always kept as floodplains, but have allowed real estate, you know, developers come in and build houses on them when it shouldn't have ever happened. Plus, it's also destroying the barrier between us and the sea. Now, we're going to be fine for a lot longer living in Dallas because, you know, all those poor souls in Houston and Corpus, they're going to be coming in our directions, but then we're going to have a real social problem because then we're going to be starting to talk about these refugees, you know, how dare they come and invade our space. So then you're going to have a whole lot of other social nonsense that goes on. Okay, and they would be fellow Texans that you'd be calling those people at that point. Okay, so I can't, you know, sit by and ignore this, and it's not only for what we, and by the way, in China's the worst polluter, followed by us. Okay, those little red spots on your map are there for a reason, Garrett. You know, but in China in particular, do you really think that the people over there wear face masks for some kind of fashion statement? They can't breathe. They can't even hold a major event in China without turning off the power, okay, and going down with the coal. And as it relates to coal, I don't care about coal cleaning or any of that jazz. There are 50 to 60,000 people employed in the coal industry. Okay? Coal is a really dirty form of energy. Okay? And all the money put into even trying to clean it up for 50 to 60,000 jobs, to me, is asinine to begin with. Okay? And not to mention the fact that even if you could, the people are still in the ground, they're still mining the stuff. So let's not even begin to talk about the COPD cases or what have you that are there in that area. The health in that whole region is really deplorable. So I really don't care that the coal industry takes a nosedive. Should have done so a long time ago. And if you go back to the 70s and you can think about how much far ahead would we have been as a country in particular, but maybe it would have been passed on to the rest of the world. Jimmy Carter wanted the auto industry to add 5 miles per gallon efficiency every year going forward, so that we would have cars that would be more efficient. Of course, Reagan threw that away when he came into office and ripped solar panels off the White House roof in all his arrogance, and also to support the big boys in energy. However, the point I want to make is that my car that I drive today gets no more mileage than the car that I drove in 1976. So that is deplorable, okay? So that's all I've got to say. Open up your eyes, your ears, and smell what used to be roses, okay? And get back there. Thank you.
You know, all of this talk about climate change is talking about government policy. Government is force. So what we're really talking about is using the government to force people to do what we think they ought to do against their will to solve a problem that we perceive. The free market has always been far more effective at solving problems than government. You know, I mean, we went from horses and buggies to cars and planes and all that kind of stuff, and that was done by private enterprise. It wasn't done by government. Government didn't come up with airplanes, and they didn't come up with cars, and they didn't come up with buildings and all that kind of stuff. Private enterprise, inventors, people came up with these things. Government is force, and the whole, no matter what, you know, what we're going to end up with if we do climate change is we're going to have California's policies imposed on the whole country. Because those are the people, the fruits and nuts that run California, are basically have free reign to do whatever they want to solve whatever problem they perceive. And they are in the forefront of dealing with climate change. And so we can expect to see the same kind of policies imposed on everyone else if we decide to invest in this climate change stuff. The free market is far more effective at solving problems. So if the free market believes that climate change is a problem, the free market will come up with solutions for it and will implement those solutions. Government is never going to be effective at doing that. All government is good at is tyranny, and it does it really well.
Who's going next?
I'll second. Well, I think we've just heard some words from a climate anti-government person. So I think one of the problems is that climate change is happening, but it's slow and insidious. it's just like something else that has been happening, equally serious actually, that has been slow and insidious. I think if you look back about 40 years or so, the main thing you did if you had a car was clean the bugs off.
That's true.
Now, you don't do that anymore. The bugs have been disappearing. And so, now, who talks about that? And I ask questions, why? No, but I think everybody can attest here, this is happening. Now, since we need bees to pollinate our fruit, keep us fed, that's a serious problem. Now, of course, there are people saying, well, we shouldn't regulate. The free market will take care of everything. Well, I'm afraid it doesn't. What happens is the big boys will actually pollute streams, pollute the air. Actually, what they do for private profit, they actually dump the pollution onto the public purse, actually. Pollute the streams, pollute the air, and so on and so forth. So the free market, really, it's nice to think it would work perfectly, but it doesn't. I mean, if the free market worked, we wouldn't have the stock market crashes and wipe out of the whole financial system if everything works so wonderfully. Well, I'm afraid it doesn't. We see that. And so, yes, we do need regulation. We do need scientists. I happen to be one, and I tend to believe them. Because, now, of course, scientists can be wrong, that's true, but it's usually self-correcting. Now, as our speaker said, over 90% of the climate scientists agree that warming is happening. And in fact, there is evidence with glaciers disappearing and so on, and warming, going on. You can see it. Especially, it's actually around the equator that you're seeing the fastest rising. But the biggest rise is in fact the oceans. They're definitely warming, which is having a devastating effect on fish stocks, because some of the fish can't change and adapt that fast, actually, to thrive, actually. I mean, we can laugh all we like about flatulence in cows and stuff like that, but really speaking, if it gets to a point where we have to think again on things, then we're going to have to think again. Now, I'm not a fan of fascist governments dictating everything. I don't think that's, but I think there is some prudence and regulation. It's basically common sense in a way. Now, I mean, if we do go over, if we end the century about 4 degrees warming, and the ice caps do melt, then I think you'll see some really now, if you think, well, don't worry about it, and certainly for me, I'll be dead by then anyway, so I won't particularly care. But certainly it's the young people that are becoming alarmed about this and saying, okay, you've bequeathed a lot of benefits on us, like this pollution of the atmosphere. I mean, as John said, I mean, nuclear power is supposed to be a godsend, but it turns out, it has this long-lasting, non-degrading stuff that we can't seem to bury and get rid of. So yes, I don't think free market by itself does work all the time. I mean, I'm for competition, I'm for innovation, I'm for creating businesses and so on and so forth. We need that. We don't want to be Luddites, but certainly we can't let private industry pollute everything and pass the costs onto the public purse, which is what they do. And we've seen that in the past. This is why you have the Clean Air Act, for example, and the Clean Waters Act, because they've done that. It's without doubt they do that, and they would do that. And also the coal industry. I mean, in Wales, for example, the coal industry piled up slag on a hillside, and one day the rains came and it gave way in Aberfan, and I believe several hundred children died because the whole thing engulfed the school. So yes, you do need regulations, because these people that are profit driven don't care about people. They really don't. They don't give a damn. As long as their stock price goes up, they're quite happy. And they pass these costs on to the general public. In this case, they passed it on to several hundred children. So yes, these things are going on around the world. It is somewhat, and we're seeing actually around the world more and more fascism appearing, and dictators that Trump seems to love so much. And as coming from a country that really wrecked itself over defeating fascism, I'm pretty much appalled by that. Okay, thanks.
Well, 5 minutes is not enough time to really address this issue. I do thank the speaker for giving a very good presentation supporting his point of view. And Sierra Club, if you're not familiar, Dallas Sierra Club probably would welcome a presentation there. I video their events. I am much less combative and so forth when I'm in that environment. I'm there to do a job and support everybody's chance to have their say and have free speech. And I think that's very important that everybody gets a voice and has a voice. At the same time, I've been through, this isn't my first rodeo. I started looking into the hydrofluorocarbon situation where you had 3 people getting Nobel Prizes while DuPont was losing their patent on Freon. And I went out searching and I found scientists saying, well, nobody can reproduce the results either in the lab or in the environment. And so I was beginning to see politics or money move into science way back when we were worried about our refrigerators leaking. Fluoride is heavier than air, and you find if I confront somebody who's a true believer, they'll say, well, it just kind of gets mixed and it gets carried up there and it's destroying the ozone layer up there. And I could give you a whole lecture on how the ozone layer is a self-repairing function. But anyway, I think we really need to confront our collective insanity. Here we are concerned about global warming, and we are neglecting Fukushima. Fukushima is still just pouring immense amounts of radiation into the Pacific and affecting fish life and plankton life in the Pacific. Why there is no international team, why the world is not throwing their best resources at something that obviously Japan can't handle, I have no idea. But I think if we look in the mirror, we really need to consider that we're just not really looking at the issues straight on. I did help some people look at the Kahia Reef situation, and I got a reply back that some of the Huna elders agreed with me. That didn't stop them from going ahead and doing the treaty, and they lost their indigenous land there with the reef. So I'm very suspicious of corporate having an influence in this. As I say, all the wrong cast of characters have been at the forefront pushing this global warming agenda. It's not just Al Gore. A lot of the big money people are very much on board with it, and I would say, this is one of those look in the mirror things to question why people who basically have demonstrated they're all about money, why are they interested in global warming, climate change, carbon tax. And I think it's pretty easy to deduce that there is an angle for them there. And as the society and culture becomes less Christian, we have less people buying papal indulgences. If we can get an international carbon tax, then we can all be taxed for breathing. So we have our new original sin. We produce carbon. That's one view on the situation. Glaciers have been melting for 10,000 years. The Grand Canyon is an example. We have glaciers. I mean, it's a good thing, I think, that glaciers are melting. We can debate about CO2 levels. I think I can go out there and I can find scientists who say that the Earth was much more healthy when they had 2,000 parts per million of CO2 because the plant life was just going tremendously. And you just had incredible plant growth and so forth because plants breathe CO2. When you start eliminating CO2, then plants start having a problem and you start getting desertification. One scientist was responsible in Africa for eliminating 40,000 elephants because he held the theory that the elephants were responsible for desertification in Africa. He found out exactly the opposite. He found out that in fact he'd killed 40,000 beautiful creatures for nothing, and that they actually helped the grasslands and they actually helped the environment. And he came back seeing that in fact one of the great benefits we had were the buffalo herds in this country, where the bisons were traveling all over. They're basically aerating the soil with their hooves and leaving their leavings and creating the mineralization and everything for the plants to grow, the fertilization. And so I would say that climate is a very complex issue that we only have had really a few hundred years to have a handle on. And for my part, I'm very concerned about the environment and about especially the public parks and wildlife scenes. If you want to ever see a wildlife scene, you just need to come to my property, and I've got raccoons to spare. If you have any need of a raccoon, I'm sure we could trap one or two, and you can go away and I wouldn't even notice them gone. As far as the whole situation with the carbon tax, fundamentally the way it ends up being structured is it's a license to pollute, so that your big corporations can always just incorporate the cost of their polluting into their product and then pass it on. And then the smaller companies can't compete with the same regulations, so it gives them a market advantage. If we're going to deal with environmental pollution problems, I'm wondering why all the focus on CO2 when we can't even deal with fluoride in our water. That is one of the most illogical things going on right now. It affects human health, has a very deleterious effect. You know, one of your most dangerous places to be is in a dentist's office, where they're putting poisons in your mouth, fluoride, mercury fillings. Then every time you drink a hot cup of coffee on a cold day, you're getting mercury vapors that you're ingesting and doing all kinds of damage, nervous system damage, tissue damage. So I would say that I can respect the presenter's position, but I just can't see CO2 as the great villain. It hasn't been proven to me. I had one scientist I came across, and I mean, you can go out on the internet, you can find minority reports on this whole thing. This one scientist, a physicist, Hal Lewis, said, "It is the global warming scam with the trillions of dollars driving it that has corrupted so many scientists and has carried APS before it like a rogue wave. It is the greatest and most successful pseudoscientific fraud I have seen in my long life as a physicist.
I guess I'm the last one standing. I gotta thank our speaker for doing a great job here today. He was all thinking in different ways, and he directed. I'm really proud of him for delving into this issue. And we've had so many speakers here on different issues that came up. Just a week ago, we had a speaker on wanted to give everybody $1,000 to spend themselves to stimulate the economy. Thought that would work. There are so many things that have to be done, but I look at the climate here. 5 years ago, we had maybe 6 years ago, we had 2 days of winter a year. 2 days that we have snow in Texas, and the last 5 years we've had no snow, none. And if you've noticed that, I don't know if you have. Anyway, here in Dallas, and this summer I believe it was 90 degrees for a whole month, and that was the month of August. It was unbelievably warm, and so this is part of the problem. It's real. It's happening, and how to deal with it? Well, whatever we can do to deal with it, we have to do. And I know that one of the things about regulation. We've had some people here today that despise the government, that they're the bad people with black hats and so on. But the purpose of regulation is never to put the government on the backs of people, but to harness the forces of profit and greed and make it work for society instead of against it. So the making of money and the providing of service and all the rest go hand in hand. Vis-a-vis carving up your neighbor, going out of business, disappearing over the horizon with your teepee full of money and leaving trails of carnage and broken bodies behind you, with their corporations doing this every day. And this is what we have to fight against. And this is what we have to work towards. I was in labor years ago and managed to negotiate a 6-hour workday. I thought that was a great thing at the time. And they got a 6-hour day with 8 hours pay, and it was a good thing. And it taught me a few things. You didn't gain 2 hours leisure time. You already lost it in traffic and get it back. So society would be better off. And if you look at what's going on in society, we're constantly replacing people with machines, and machines don't pay taxes. People do, and we're putting people out of work, and we're creating a lot of jobs that what do they call it? I forget the type of economy they call it.
Service economy?
No, like Uber and all these. They have no.
The gig economy.
The gig economy. There's so many people in this. It's unbelievable, and they're not getting. There's no regulation there. Even labor doesn't even exist to them. And labor unions today are in big trouble because every time they ask for a wage increase, the company leaves town. They go overseas and leave them with nothing. And so they don't have bargaining power. And then the members of the labor union get mad at the leaders union because they're not doing anything. So in result, we're down to about 6% labor in this country, and that's not a good thing. And anyway, I don't want to bore you with a lot of this, but. I did negotiate a 6-hour workday. It did work, and I think society would be better off with that. I think we'd have more people working, paying taxes. We'd have less people not working, draining taxes. The government get twofold benefit of increased tax revenue without raising taxes. They have less bills to pay for people who aren't working as they be working. You have more time to watch your kids when you're not there because you are there. You have a better life, and life would be better, and you would have more time to address the things you're talking about. Because we got a society that's fractured. They don't know what to do anymore. They're getting torn in every different direction, and they don't know what to go for because nothing seems to work. And that's why I think that might work. And I think I applaud you for trying to do something that you're in the right direction. And that's about all I have to say. So anyway, we give it back to you. You got the last word. You get this.
I'll keep it short. I just wanted to thank everybody again for coming out, for listening to me talk. I sincerely appreciate every single one of you. I am glad to have this conversation, even if you disagree, especially if you disagree. That is one of the biggest problems going on in our society right now. We have two sides, and that's the weirdest thing. It's not two. It's not three or four. It's two. Over, you know, in broad strokes, sides that don't talk to each other, and so then we get so polarized to the point where we can't even understand each other anymore. It would take so long for me to have a conversation with some of you just to find some tiny little speck of something we agree on to start from. And it's not the fault of liberals, and it's not the fault of conservatives. It is the fault of, honestly, I don't really know. But it's a problem. That is something I hope we can all agree on, that we clearly have a problem with that. I can say that I, as a citizen, am working in what I consider to be good faith to promote a solution to a problem that I accept, like many of you, I accept the opinions of experts on, and not just one or two, but the vast majority of them. I don't know what else I can do. Who else should I listen to, right? I'm acting in good faith to make a best effort to support a policy that is as bipartisan as it can possibly be. I don't want to see just crazy regulations in order to fight climate change. I don't think we need crazy regulations. I think that we need a simple, effective, surgical policy that puts a price on carbon and then lets the market sort it out. That is the idea. That is the not the only solution, but that is, I think, that is the first best step we can take. If you agree with that, if this is a thing that you would like to support, I actually have some letters. We, as part of what we do in Citizens Climate Lobby, we get letters signed to our members of Congress, and I will actually be going to Washington, D.C. here in November, along with some other people from the DFW area and people from all over the country, to sit and lobby and talk with our members of Congress to get them to support climate action in general, and the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act in specific. So if that's something you want to support, come see me. I'll show you how you can kind of help out with that. If you disagree with me, thank you especially for your time. I am not, as I led with, you are not my enemy. You are not my enemy. We disagree, and that needs to stop being a taboo thing. That needs to stop being such a problem. We need to stop being afraid to talk to each other because we disagree, because we voted for different people in 2016. That doesn't need to be something that tears us apart. Why don't we start talking and disagreeing as friends? And that's my talk.
Well, that's the end of our formal meeting for tonight. Our speaker is still here. He's got some brochures he wants, if you want them. And they kick us out here at 10:30, but our formal meeting is over. Thanks for coming, and hope to see you next week.